Hi everyone, and welcome to Meltano Office Hours, April the 10th edition. My name is Ruben. I'm a software developer at Meltano, and this is Edgar. Would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah. Software engineer at Meltano. I've been at Meltano for about 5 years now. Happy
Yeah,
to talk about Meltano stuff today.
definitely a familiar face if you've been to Office Hours in the past. Probably seen Edgar many times. Today, we're going to be talking about state backends in Meltano. For the most part, that's the main topic of today's call. And then nearer the end, I guess we'll touch on the roadmap. And if anyone joins, we can have some sort of community discussion around today's topic, state backends, or I guess anything that crops up. But let's get stuck into it. So I guess I'll give a brief overview of state backends generally. So Meltano tracks something called state when running a tap and a target that is syncing data from a source system to a target system. Meltano will track the state automatically out of the box for you, given that the tap and target support that functionality, of course. And a state backend is a terminology or a concept to refer to where Meltano stores this state, essentially. So straight out the box with Meltano, you're probably using what we are referring to as a state backend without even knowing it. And that is Meltano is bundled or will create a system database that's a SQLite database by default. And within that little SQLite database, there's a state table, and that's where your state is stored for extract load pipelines. There are actually a couple of others that I've seen less commonly used in the wild that are actually sort of part of Meltano by default. That is S3, Azure, Google. I think they all behave the same. Obviously, there's a little more configuration around how you specify where you want that to go within S3, Azure, or Google Cloud, but definitely seen people use that in a more productionized setting. Yeah, go
You
for
had
it.
mentioned that another iteration of Meltano Cloud actually used the S3 backend. I think it was part of a motivation for state backends to have something like
Mm,
coupled as that as uh, blob storage.
Gotcha. And then, hello, Ken.
Hey,
Welcome, welcome. Nice to have a regular visitor. Welcome back. How
Yeah.
you doing?
yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, nice Easter break, 4 days off, always fun.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, good stuff. Well, we're talking about state backends this week, so feel free to chime in whenever. We've just covered the ones that are bundled with Meltano by default, just to sort of give a general idea of what state backends are for anyone who's watching. And so we've talked about these built-in ones. There are also other state backends available that we're sort of classing as external for now, whether they'll stay external or become more built into the Meltano product. I guess time will tell. Little spoiler for next week's topic, maybe. Oh, sorry, 2 weeks topic. Those are using Postgres, Snowflake, and BigQuery as a state backend, creating a state table in those warehouse systems to store state rather than relying on any of these other built-in ones. We actually use the Postgres state backend in Meltano Cloud by default now. Previously, we were relying on a sort of an amalgamation of the local state backend with Postgres functionality, but we didn't actually need the system database, turns out. So we just wanted to store the state. So we've migrated to using this Postgres state backend. Yeah, and it's been working fine. We'll touch, I think, more on like the specifics of these in some later slides. Edgar, anything to add?
No, I think that pretty much sums it.
Yeah. I guess
Yeah.
there may be something to call out here from these cards at the top is that feasibly any key value store or file system-esque tool or system could feasibly be a state backend.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not limited to the ones that we're showing here. In fact, if anyone's familiar with the FS spec library, there's a bunch of backends built onto FS spec that probably could also transition into state backends if you try hard enough. That's oh, hello. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Some of this is probably just refreshing my memory, but is the state backend used for locking, or do we support separate locking backends? Because the three things the original MySQL database was used for was states, the lock, and the logs. The actual task report. It also used it internally, I think, for a while. I actually don't know the extent to which it still does for like unpacking your settings. But the main ones, if you use an external database, you would be able to see tables for the runs. and then the state table as well. I can't remember whether locking is part of state or separate.
It's separate. Yes. I think, yeah, only the system DB is capable of locking. I think we could implement that in state backends. Right now, it will only lock for a period of time, I think, like while the target is writing, or Meltano is using the output of the target to write to the state backend. That's the only like window of time where it's locked. But otherwise, you can run things in parallel. Yeah.
Yeah, and for us, we only ever really use the state table from the system, from the original state database. We had our Before we transitioned to Meltano, we had our own representation of jobs. So I guess we were sort of mirroring what Meltano was storing. So yeah, we don't require any of that, the extra metadata of those tables anymore, which is why we transitioned to this state backend, Postgres state backend.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Ken, yeah, settings can also still be stored in the system DB. I don't know how much that is used, but yeah, yeah, it is possible to store settings in the system DB.
Yeah, and again, that's something we were doing already as well. So yeah, interesting concept that we sort of arrived at the same point and I had some similar ideas there even before we merged. Okay, so next slide is why would you want to use a state backend? I think a better way to phrase this is why would you want to use a state backend at all, even though you get one by default? What is the benefit of, I suppose, tracking state generally? Generally, it's just a good way to store, the only way to store like a bookmark where you got up to during a sync and resume from that point on the next pipeline run. So you avoid syncing data that hasn't changed at all. Um, that's more just the benefit of state, I would say, rather than using a state backend. I think more of the discussion is around why would you want to use a external state backend versus one of these built-in local ones. I think even more specifically than that, it's why would you want to use anything other than the one Meltano bundles by default, which is the local one here that doesn't require any additional configuration or dependency on a third party service like S3 or Postgres. And that is basically that the state is persisted outside of the project. The SQLite database is stored in the .meltano directory, so it's local to the project. We've been throwing around this systemdb term, which is these guys are two current Meltano employee and ex Meltano employee. So these guys are probably quite familiar with systemdb, but correct me if I'm wrong. SystemDB is very similar to what I think we're referring to here as a local state backend, but obviously it's not just inclusive of state. You were tracking runs and plugin settings in there also. And it was possible to point that systemdb externally as well. So there's sort of a bit of a gray overlap between having the like Postgres systemdb and Postgres state backend. Say for the purposes of this discussion, they are very, very similar in how they're implemented. Although when we get to the how you actually do this, I think the differences will become a little more clear. All that to say that using an external state backend means that your state is persisted outside of the project, and then is potentially be able to be versioned as a result of database backups, and restored in like a similar manner. And for us, it also possibly provides us the benefit of being able to store state alongside data or like within the data warehouse. That's also another requirement we're sort of moving more towards, storing that state alongside customer data. Anything to add?
Yeah, the systemdb, I think under the hood, if for anyone familiar with it, it uses SQL Alchemy under the hood. In theory, at least in theory, it should support like any SQL Alchemy dialect out there. So the SQL Alchemy has like built-in first-class dialects for SQLite, Postgres, MS SQL, MySQL. But I said in theory because we use some of the particulars of or features that are not supported by all of the database systems. Certain DML statements are not supported by all of the databases. So we only really like advertise support for SQLite, Postgres, and MS SQL. I think we would need to make slight adjustments for something like MySQL. I think people have tried to use the Snowflake SQL Alchemy library, and it just doesn't work because some of those migrations will fail. But yeah.
Cool. Thanks for that. Okay, so next slide is talking about the where of state backends, I suppose. So if you want to install any of the alternative built-in state backends, you would install them as an extra alongside the Meltano package. So usually you specify that. I don't know, Python has about 400 different ways that you can pip install something. We've chosen UV here because that's like the common best practice at the moment, I think. But generally the package specifier is the same in that you would provide Meltano, and then within square brackets, you provide S3, Azure, or GCS. External state backends, Postgres, Snowflake, and BigQuery, that are a little more involved to install alongside Meltano. Importantly, they're not extras. I guess you could potentially run into sort of compatibility issues down the line, which is why we're always thinking about how we can make these more first-party supported within Meltano. But at the moment, you install Meltano and you install the particular state backend package alongside Meltano within the same virtual environment. Something to call out here is I think Snowflake is on Pipe, but we've just referenced the Git repository here just as because the other ones aren't. So just for convention's sake, they're all the same.
Yeah.
Then we're on to the how. How do you actually use state backends? So within Meltano, you can configure state backends just as you would configure any other plugin, which, skipping ahead a bit, I think there was some discussion around actually making state backends part of the plugin ecosystem eventually, like a new type of plugin, which would bring it more in line with like first party support, like we were just talking about. Here's an example of how you configure S3. So configure the environment variables here. So quick refresher on Meltano is that you can configure settings through environment variables. So you can just export them and Meltano will pick them up, and then you can set your URI in Meltano in a similar way. I actually think this is probably not necessary to set as environment variables here. Like you could set these in a similar way down here, and because they're classed as sensitive settings, Meltano will intelligently put them in the .env file rather than sticking them in your Meltano YAML and then you accidentally committing them to source control and having a terrible time as a result. But yeah, this is generally how you connect to an S3 backend. Like this is very common credentials for S3 as far as I'm aware. Access key ID, secret access key for most AWS things. Set the URI to your bucket, and then you can list the state that's in there, get the state that's in there. And I believe just by configuring these will mean that Meltano will just run with the S3 backend, right?
You need the state backend URI. That's what tells Meltano which state backend to use. I think it did. Yeah, it uses the URI scheme, so the S3 part of that string, to identify which state backend to use. Yep.
Yeah. More of a question for my curiosity. Can you have multiple state backends define a project and sort of switch them within like an environment?
I actually don't know if you can use them between environments. I don't think so. I don't think you can set like global Meltano project level settings in an environment, only plugin level settings.
Yeah.
But what you can do is put all your state backend configuration in environment variables and switch with that. I don't know exactly which version of Meltano added, but we added support for .env files. So you could have a production .env file and a development .env file and have different state backends configured in those.
Oh, that's cool. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Is that the suffix of the env file is picked up relating to the active environment?
Not at the moment. At the moment, you have to specify the full name of the .env file when you run with Meltano. So Meltano, I think it's the M file flag, and you point to the name of the file. That's not yet smart enough to use different prefixes for different environments or anything.
Cool. Thanks for that. Here's a similar example with Postgres. Here we're demonstrating the, I guess, difference between the built-in S3 way of specifying that backend and then what we're referring to as the external Postgres state backend here. So performing the install. Again, very similar here. I guess the only difference here is Postgres is a SQL Alchemy string, so you can fully specify like all your credentials within the one string. This is actually what we do in Meltano Cloud, and that we just provide this like I guess, fully qualified string containing all the credentials that we need, have that set, and then you're good to go using that state backend for your other state operations.
Yeah, that makes it backwards compatible with the systemd version of Postgres. So
Yeah. We had
yeah,
some to and froing with that when we were developing it, right? That we were
yeah,
trying to, I think unknowingly we wanted it to be compatible and then quickly realized, oh, we actually want it to support, I think specifically this C search, like C search path option here,
yeah,
uh,
exactly. Yep.
to show the schemas that are discoverable to you. So when is it a good idea to use an external state backend, I think we're more referring to here? So when do you want to not rely on Meltano's default local state backend? And when would you want to choose one of the other S3 or Azure or Postgres state backends? I think it's mostly when you want to promote your project out of a I'm testing it locally and I want to put my project somewhere else. I want it to run in a production or a staging setting, but more autonomously than you would otherwise be. I think generally that's because those environments are ephemeral. Obviously, things like pods like start up and tear down. So you want your state persisted outside of that environment. And so it makes sense to put it in a persistent environment that isn't the local project so that you can resume after things are like spun up and torn down as appropriate. And then the other use of state backend is when you want to transition between one to another. For example, if you wanted to move someone who's on a Postgres state backend to Snowflake, that is a use for state backends that we are actively exploring and developing currently, mostly because we've got some customer requirements that will need that. So like we've been touching on, we are actively using these external state backends ourselves. So we've transitioned to using this Postgres state backend rather than this Postgres system DB way of working somewhat recently. So if you are also using the Postgres system DB and you're only interested in state, it might be worth exploring the Postgres state backend and potentially transitioning to that. Again, like we said, it's backwards compatible. So fingers crossed. Pretty sure there's no issues that you can just switch over to that with no problem. The other one is BigQuery that we also tested for a customer and got working in a production setting. Edgar, do you want to touch more on that? I think you might have some more context on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think by default, customers of Meltano Cloud have a Postgres database attached to
Yeah.
their workspace, right? So right now, that's where their state is stored. But if you're using a different data warehouse like Snowflake or BigQuery, we could just switch them to use their own data warehouse to store a Meltano state. I probably should mention another advantage of this Postgres state backend and the other ones that are not bundled with Meltano is that we can make improvements to them without having to change the core of Meltano. So we can make more and faster releases of the state backends. And Meltano can have its own release cadence.
Yeah, that's a good point. So again, just like a plugin almost, sort of see how it fits into the same plugin lifecycle or ecosystem I did.
Yeah.
And I think one of the main points of BigQuery was the customer wanted their state alongside their data. Their data was in BigQuery. So we set up the BigQuery state backend and then the state was right alongside their data. So they were in control of everything rather than the provisioned Postgres database containing the state and the data elsewhere. Okay. So I guess I had a little question about state backends just before we move on to what we're working on. I'll just go back to slides. Fundamentally, what is the difference between the way state backends are implemented here and I guess more specifically, the S3 Azure and the Google ones here? Because feasibly, these could become external in the same way that these are, right? Not built in. Is there any
Yeah.
benefit to one or the other?
Not really. I mean, most of the distinction is there for historical reasons. So back when state backends were added to Meltano, we went with this so local file system and this common blob storage systems, and of course systemd, which is another state backend. So we implemented like under the hood, it's a very simple Python class system or hierarchy. So if we wanted to implement new state backends that are bundled with Meltano, it'd be just as easy as subclassing. I think it's the state manager class or something like that, and and adding the settings, etc. So that would be fairly easy to do. The disadvantage of doing that is that, again, they would be tied to the Meltano release cadence. And yeah, we could extract the S3, Azure, and Google Cloud to their own packages external to Meltano. That's certainly something we could do. I think, potential breaking change is that right now you can get the S3 state backend like we showed here, like the official way is with the S3 extra when you install with UB or PEEP. But you could also get the functionality by just installing the Boto3 library with Meltano. That would get you the same functionality. You would get the state backend. You could use the state backend. So it's already there. But if you don't install that dependency, you will not be able to use the S3 state backend. So right now you can do that. So install Meltano, install Boto3, and you get the S3 state backend. But if we make the state backend an external dependency, then that would no longer work. You would have to install that package instead of just Boto3. But
because the implementation lives inside Meltano currently.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that would block us from pulling those out of the core, which arguably probably not a lot of people are doing that.
Yeah.
You're gonna break someone's workflow with every change you make, I guess.
Do these state backends here, do they import Meltano and then use that like abstract class interface to implement?
Yes, they have a dependency on Meltano. Yes.
Okay, that's interesting because that's sort of bridging. I think 2 weeks ago we sort of touched on Meltano as a library and that being a long-standing feature request, and it is kind of being used in that way here.
Yeah, I guess a small subset of Meltano is a public API that I've been careful not to like make breaking changes there because I know it's a public API. Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah.
Nice. And so I think it's pretty easy to see if you had like another key sort system or file system that you would just implement the get, set, update methods or whatever.
One I imagine is DynamoDB, for example, would be a good example of a system that is almost like a perfect fit for a state backend.
Nice. Okay, so bit of a step back from state backends now. Generally, what we're working on this current week or going forward, we've had a big push to get a couple of connectors done, and that is Google Search, Google Analytics, Pinterest, TikTok. That is generally adopting them into Meltano Labs and improving them to work with Meltano Cloud better. So for these two Google tabs, we've implemented proper OAuth login support. So if you go and add a Google Search Console or Google Analytics to a workspace, now it'll be presented with a Connect to Google option, and Meltano Cloud handles the client credentials flow behind the scenes. So you just authorize access and we'll do the rest. Kind of thing. So that simplifies the configuration that was quite complicated before, especially I think with the Google ones in particular, always a bit notorious in how difficult it was to get a refresh token to actually run taps. Similar with Pinterest, I believe. Pinterest OAuth as well.
Yes, yeah, it has OAuth support.
Yeah, so we're constantly adding new OAuth like connectors. If you'd asked me if Pinterest was one of those, I probably wouldn't have said like they have like an OAuth login, but here we are. That's cool. You can log in with your Pinterest account now, and TikTok as well. So we're constantly picking up these like OAuth supported connectors to streamline the configuration for a user and make it simpler to get the data from that system as a result. There are a couple of other ones that are being worked on but not currently released. So watch this space for, I think, Rakuten advertising is coming soon, and we've also got probably a less known system, but I'll shout it out anyway. Dynomi is I'm not actually sure what the system is, but I got told to build the connector, so I built the connector. It's like advertising and publisher stuff. Bit of a small one, I think, but yeah, anyone who knows Dynomi, that's coming soon too. Generally, that sort of stems into this community section here with we're doing more and more testing, more and more connector development and adoption. I think that is always going to be a common theme in these office hours of calling new connectors out, and it's always going to be an ongoing effort to maintain them and adopt new and exciting ones that we come across and that are required by customers. Yep, always working on the cloud too. So we've got a backlog list of features and fixes that are always being worked on. So I think we're trying to standardize the release process for that as well. So I think at some point in the future, we'll be announcing cloud updates like we are announcing SDK and CLI updates. So yeah, watch the space for that. And for the hub, Edgar's amazing at merging people's funky plugin pull requests in. Yeah, so I've seen a fair amount of activity on the hub actually recently. So everyone who had a plugin goes to the hub.
Yeah.
Will probably accept your PR. I think, yeah, just a note on the hub, I think, is I think generally we prefer that there is a more sort of like standard like variant that people contributed to rather than like adding variants for the sake of adding variants. I'm
Yeah.
thinking of Tap Oracle specifically, but I think the reason that that was added as a variant was because the old one was very out of date and I think the guy who wrote Oracle was sort of the opinion it was worth rewriting as a better new variant.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, is that
Yeah.
your understanding? I mean, I read the issue.
No, I don't think it's the same person. I didn't actually check that, but yeah, to your point that we've seen more contributions to the hub recently. I think just agentic tools make writing a new app from scratch super easy, lowers the barrier significantly. Yeah. Yeah, but we want to, like you said, have more people contribute to the official variants, and of course that means us having more of those in Meltano Labs or the Matitica org. So yeah,
Yes. Yeah, it kind of freaks me out when I've seen that like Lads has about 20 something forks now. Occasionally I'll go
yeah,
through and click through all the forks and be like, oh, is there anything we can like steal back from these ones back into our tap to make it better? So yeah, please open pull requests on taps as well.
yeah.
I would very much like that. Yeah. So open to the room where we have one seat filled currently. So Ken, do not feel any pressure if you don't have any questions, but if you do want to raise something, go for it.
Yeah, I think the agentic point is definitely of interest. I think the like day one challenge of creating a tap is definitely sped along. But I wonder if there's one thing we've struggled to quantify and that we weren't really able to find a scalable solution to previously was assessing the coverage of a given tap. So getting the most recent documentation of the API, looking at the source code of the tap and identifying how much of that is implemented, and then coming up with some kind of score for like the coverage report of the tap. That feels like something that like Claude will have for breakfast. So I wonder if there's sort of an agent.md or a Meltano agent.md type construct where you list the documentation site and you sort of give the AI those basic instructions for periodically we want to go and compare the external documentation with the latest or whatever docs URL to what is implemented here, and we want you to alert us when this tap is out of date or drifted. Something like that would really drive up the quality and take tons of work. I think the original premise of the Singer ecosystem was that it's such a huge task that you could only really do it by crowdsourcing. These things are open source because if everybody does a little bit, the whole community gets high quality taps and targets. And I think in an agentic world, it's much, much easier than it has been to, nobody wants to spend an afternoon reading the Salesforce docs and then reading the tap Salesforce implementation and like doing that comparison. But it feels much more in reach to, give that 3-minute task to an AI. So, how are you guys thinking about using AIs not just for that like day one authoring experience, but for the sort of like knowledge farming or update farming for taps and targets?
Yeah. Do you have anything, Ruben? If not, I can share something.
I've definitely thought about coverage like that, not necessarily thought about like AI using it. I mean, when I say I've thought about it, I'm thinking of way back in the day when I think it was like one of the first Meltano hack days and we were building taps for the first time. I chose Auth0, which has a lot of endpoints. And so I was like, oh, wow, there's kind of like too many here for me to handle. And actually, this is kind of what we do for when there's a new request from a customer, at least that comes in at the moment. It's just we just implement the streams that we require then and there. Obviously, that's not great for someone else coming in who's like, oh, actually, I want this other stream. And then you go through this whole process of, oh, actually, we need to add support for this, blah, blah, blah. So having some visibility of that, like as a metric, would be super useful. Totally agree on that. Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm interested to see how that would work in a production setting. Yeah.
Yeah. My contribution to that is that I think a month or so ago, I vibe coded a throwaway script for this what I call it CRM service titan that one of our customer uses. It's a an interesting case because it has open API documentation, but it has like many sub APIs, and each of those has its own API document, open API document. So I wanted to, from by request of our customer, like go through all of the API documentation and see, are we missing any endpoints that we could turn into streams to get the data from? We basically want all of the data we can get. And so this small throwaway script that I vibe coded would just like output a table with endpoint or stream candidates from endpoints. Like, okay, this is an endpoint with a get method option, and it has like an array with items in the schema. So it's a good candidate for Singer stream, things like that. And they would give you a score of the endpoints. I just went ahead and fed that into Cloud Code. And yeah, it added a bunch of new streams. But yeah, definitely something along those lines.
Yeah. I do think it is kind of dependent on the quality of the documentation, quite naturally. What kind of score you'll get back. So you almost need like a score, and here's how confident I am in the score thing, in a weird kind of way. I only say that because we switched from Codex to Claude. I switched from Codex, company Codex subscription to Claude subscription the other day. And so I thought I'll build this dynamic tap with Claude and pointed it at the documentation because again, kind of still don't have any knowledge about what dynamic is, and was like, just go and implement me these streams from what you can find in the documentation essentially. And dynamic has publisher API docs and advertiser docs. And I think it kind of conflated the two and started picking out these specific stats that pertain to publishers. They're actually, I think we wanted more of the like advertiser stat stuff. But then it turns out there's a bunch of stats that they don't publicly document that were required. Again, there's a bunch of streams that, without actually interacting with someone at Dynami, there would be no visibility of. But I think you would probably get a fairly high score back from the AI just looking at that documentation.
Yeah, I should probably mention one risk of just pointing whatever automation tool to an open API document and getting a bunch of streams is that some APIs have like feature gates, like you have to be a paying customer or an enterprise customer to have access to certain endpoints. And if you add all of the endpoints, the normal user, when they run the tab, they're going to run into a bunch of errors, right? Because they don't have access to that endpoint. They will have to filter out the streams that they don't have access to, things like that. So maybe the feature that we were looking at the other day, Ruben, basically run through all the Singer tab runs through all the streams. If there's a failure, it just keeps the stream and goes to the next. That would be helpful there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm super excited for that one because that would be super great for a bunch of some of the customer setups that we've currently got, where we've had to sort of like, I think we've had to reorder streams, basically like splitting things out into like 2 Meltano runs, like running everything and then running this lower priority one, or lower priority one last. So it would be good to either be able to order streams to run in a specific order. That kind of goes away if you like parallelize it all, a la our conversation 2 weeks ago, or you just continue on all of these errors and like sort of give a report summary of like what paths have failed. But yeah, agree in general that would be a good one to see.
Cool. Are you guys planning to do a demo of Meltano Cloud as it exists right now at some point? Or is there a video demo already up on the website that I can just go and poke around at?
I'm not actually sure. Akalash, are you there?
Yeah, it's something we are working on right now, so it should be live very soon.
I think there's a small clips in the Meltano.com. At least you can see the UI, right, Akalash?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, we definitely should do a demo walkthrough in one of these office hours at some point as well. I can see that becoming a week topic where we dig into that and how that all works.
Yeah, that'd be super cool, particularly getting the like product engineers view of the product rather than the landing page view. It's always cool to see how these things are built and what's happening under the hood.
Yeah, cool. We'll take that on board. Thanks. We have any other slides here? No. Does anyone have anything else they want to add? Generally, sort of approaching time, but we're quite a ways, couple minutes away from stopping if you want. So fill the silence if you like.
Yeah.
I might make a new. Go ahead, Ken. Go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead.
Just a quick mention that I would probably make a new release of Montana today. One, because there's a few items in the changelog, that would be good to just release. And also that will fix latest Docker tag, which I haven't yet fixed. That would Disney release would fix that. So yeah.
Yeah. Anyone watching who had migrated from 3 to 4, they're about to get migrated again. Yeah, heads up on that one if you're using Docker latest.
Yeah, you're using the latest tag.
Yeah, cool. My question was just going to be an FYI. I had been aware that we do locking as part of state, and I had confused that with the job level locking that is also done using the system DB. They're two separate mechanisms. So the state lock just locks the state file to do an update, to stop concurrent updates. It doesn't lock the job. So you still need a system DB for job locking. I 100% thought you only needed one. So we've had an S3 backend configured, and I was like, this is great. S3 does our state, and it also is doing our locking. So I don't have to, stand up a database or think about concurrent runs in our use case. But that's not true. I do need to think about concurrent runs in our use case.
Is that the feature in Meltano where if something's running already, you get the error like based on the state of the job?
Exactly. You have to use the force flag if you want to ignore that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it would be cool to move that job stuff out of a relational database to have a job locking, something configurable. In bygone eras, everybody used DynamoDB for this. Now that S3 is strongly consistent, so read after to write consistent, you can use S3 now for locking as if it was a file lock. So yeah, I think Terraform migrated. We got a deprecation message not that long ago saying the DynamoDB locking in Terraform has moved to S3 exactly because S3 released the feature. So it would be cool to be able to do Meltano job locking using S3 as well. And that would effectively for us, because we're collecting logs from the container and we get them in CloudWatch logs on ECS, that would allow us to essentially run our Meltano jobs stateless or without a relational database backend.
Do you see that implemented as something similar to how we were talking about state backends here?
Yeah, in my mind, they were already the same thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly what the implementation would be. Maybe supplying an S3 bucket prefix bucket at the job lock would be sufficient. I think the way this currently works is it looks at the job model and tries to find a job with the same ID. So you effectively use either an S3 prefix as your key value. Is there a lock file underneath this prefix, and each job ID gets its own part of the path, or you do something more sophisticated with a single lock with multiple prefixes in it. But something along those lines that would allow us to lock a job using S3 rather than a relational backend would be super cool.
Yeah, I think that's so. The system DB concept was encompassing that and state. I don't think we've run into job blocking requirements ourselves because we use the state ID suffix to sort of uniquely identify every job that we run in Meltano as well, which makes handling of state a little funky because it's a UUID value, so it makes it really annoying when you want to migrate something somewhere else. But I guess with that model, we hadn't considered the benefit of having the job blocking decentralized also. I can maybe see state backends and job blocking potentially in the same thing, whether that's system DB backend rather than state backend or something, or you have them as two separate things that are two different plugin types again, two additional plugin types to the one that are blocked.
Yeah, I think the challenge is the state service is only used currently in the target. And so your target has to be running before it can write state. And therefore the locking mechanism is too low down in the chain. The way the job, it's higher up in the call chain. When it instantiates the block itself, the EL block, decides whether it runs any tap or target before using that job model. So I think it would be a separate locking mechanism specifically for job locks. But yeah.
Good that you guys know so much about the internals of Meltano. You basically did my job for me.
It's definitely been a while. And as I said, I saw that Stake supported locking and I was like, oh, that's great. That means job locking. And it definitely doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, well, maybe that's something we should also consider as well. Yeah, hadn't even thought about job locking before we prepared this presentation. So yeah, thanks for raising that. That's interesting.
We use the prefixes to make sure that two runs of the same tap target wouldn't conflict with each other. So if we use tap REST API in a bunch of places, we want to give them each a prefix, but those prefixes are stable for a given pipeline. So if we have, 2 internal APIs, we'll create a prefix for each internal API, but we could still run multiple concurrent jobs for a given API with the prefix. So just setting the prefix alone only helps you if every single run gets its own prefix. And in that case, I don't think you're benefiting from state. The whole purpose of state is that the next time you run, you look up the state from the previous one. So that prefix has to be stable if you want to make use of incremental loads and the history.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this job locking is maybe if you handle it with your orchestrator, it can be safe. If you're using Airflow or whatever, and you set your concurrency to 1, Airflow will enforce it. But it's also super handy. Meltano's got that final failsafe of if I know someone else is running at the same time with the same job ID, I won't run.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was thinking when we moved to this Postgres state backend, we actually were specifying the -- force flag on Meltano run by default because we had that state ID suffix that meant we knew as the orchestrator that things were unique. Since we moved to that state backend, I think the force flag is now redundant, but only because of the way we run Meltano in like each job is like an isolated pod. And so there's like a system DB per pod, so it only knows about that one particular running job. So there's no need to specify the force flag anymore. But I guess you've lost the benefit of job locking there generally. Might make sense to externalize that and get that functionality back somehow.
Another issue with concurrent runs, I quickly mentioned that I noticed we have some customers on Dagster, and so we have some concurrent jobs. So there's jobs that trigger 2 or more Meltano runs within the same job run in Dagster. So they start with a clean Meltano project, and then they install and run. But if 2 or more of those jobs are using the same tap target combination, they will try to use the same, even if you have a state suffix ID, they will try to use the same catalog file, for example. So when you run tap target, Meltano caches the catalog, where if you're running a bunch of those in parallel, then they're race conditions essentially. One of those jobs is already writing to the catalog, and another one is reading, and there's conflicts there. So that's another concurrency issue right now with Meltano. Should probably address at some point.
Yeah, I guess we've just avoided that because of the way we run Meltano under the covers.
Yeah.
A pod per job. I guess that's not how it's running the Dagster.
Not all of the time. If you just run one asset at a time, it's good. But if you have a job that runs multiple assets, that's when.
Is it like per schedule? Like it kind of comes around and runs like 2 things in one?
Yeah, so essentially you can have a triggers in Dagster, and we have some of those, like something updates upstream, then we want to run a bunch of the instances of the same tab in parallel, but that normally don't run together, but in their own separate asset jobs. So yeah, that's when that happens.
Having thought about that a little bit more, actually, we have a community edition which runs like completely locally. So obviously there's no Kubernetes involved in that setup. It actually just runs with the Meltano that's bundled like within the Docker image, and then you attach the project volume to that Docker runtime. I think there will be more of a problem there if we start tinkering around with job blocking and stuff a little bit more that we have to consider. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for raising that again. It's definitely interesting. Something to talk about or think about some more. And if anyone for anything else, otherwise I think we're good. 2 minutes. Cool. Thanks for coming, Ken, and thanks to anyone else who's watching. Get to the end of this slide just to formalize this. Thank you for watching. This has been April 10th Office Hours. See us again in 2 weeks' time. We'll talk about some more state backend stuff and some like moving state to the target discussion as well. More around this generally. Thanks for watching.